Hey guys, it's Cosmic Skeptic, and we hit 350,000 subscribers. That's a hell of a lot of people, and in fact, I think it's on 365,000 now, and maybe even more by the time this video finally goes out. I've been a little bit busy. I've been working on quite a big video that's going to be coming out at some point over the next month, hopefully. It's a bit of a project that I've set for myself, but I'm really excited about it, but it just means I've had no time. But it was quite a while ago now that I asked you for questions on YouTube and Twitter and Instagram to do a 350,000 subscriber Q&A, but I saved them and I've got them, and I thought it'd be fun to sit down and just go through some of the most popular questions. So the first question comes from Martin on Twitter, and he asks, when are you going to write a book? I'm actually kind of writing one at the moment, but I'm looking for literary representation. I want to write something of a manifesto on the vegan philosophy and animal rights, the kind of stuff I've been talking about in my speeches and in the videos I've done on animal liberation, and put it into a kind of pamphlet form. So, you know, if there's any literary agents out there watching this, or if you know a literary agent, then hit me up. And kind of related to that, Jess asks, what video are you the most proud of that you've released? And I think the answer would have to be the animal rights speech that I gave in Tel Aviv in 2019. If you go onto my YouTube channel, it's like the pinned video. If you just go onto the channel, it's the one at the top. I just really like the way the speech turned out. I actually wrote it kind of last minute. I wrote it the morning of the day that I gave it backstage while there were people running around me and kind of distracting me, so I didn't expect it to turn out too well. But I've had a lot of feedback of people saying that they liked the speech, they liked the style, and some people saying it even convinced them to consider going vegan, so it's probably the one I'm most proud of for that reason. But this is perhaps subject to change, because this video that I say I've been working on that's been keeping me so busy is going to be a kind of big production. I'm planning to get out of the house and film in some more interesting locations and make it a really long, in-depth video into quite an important topic, and if that goes well, I might do more videos in that kind of style. I'm excited to see what you think about it, but the way that I'm kind of envisioning that video going, it might become one of my favorite videos because I'm putting so much effort into it. I might be more proud of it than anything else I've ever done, but I don't know until it comes out, and see what you guys have to think. Kieran on YouTube asks, what is the best piece of criticism to an argument of your own that you have received? And this is a really important question, right? In the interests of honesty, it's always crucial to be making sure that you're looking out for the best versions of the best kinds of criticisms to any ideas that you hold. Now, this might be something of a disappointing answer, but I think the best criticisms I've received of opinions that I've expressed in previous videos have come from private conversations, especially ones I've had with friends that I've met at university. And I think the reason for this is that if you're having a conversation with someone on a public platform, it's more difficult to be truly honest and to retract things immediately, or you're slightly worried about how it's going to come across and how you're going to be perceived, and you kind of put up a bit of a barrier to honest conversation. As hard as you might try, it's always naturally going to be there. Even if you manage to be as honest as possible, the person you're talking to might not be, and it won't be the most constructive kind of conversation. But at university, in various pubs and bars, I've met so many people who've really challenged everything that I think about religion and about philosophy and ethics in a kind of fun, a jovial, a kind of honest and open way. It's much more refreshing than the kind of stuff you usually see online, which is often quite vicious and back and forth and trying to debunk each other just for the sake of debunking each other. The conversations I've had there have been incredibly challenging. Now, of course, unfortunately, that means there's nothing I can really point you to directly, but what I can say is that one of the people that I met at university, a friend of mine called Ryan, who's one of the people who I've spoken to most about philosophy of religion and who's challenged me the most, just started a YouTube channel. He's currently studying, he's just about to start studying for a PhD on the ontological argument, and he's got a YouTube channel called Maximally Great Philosophy, which is a name I only wish I could have come up with myself. But his very first video, and he's only got one video so far, is a criticism of my old video on the ontological argument. Now, you may know, if you're familiar with this channel, that recently I made a video debunking myself, quote unquote, on the Kalam cosmological argument, and I was planning to do the same thing for my ontological argument video, because I've changed my mind regarding a lot of things I said in that video, but I think Ryan's actually done probably a better job than I could have done in debunking that video. So if you want to check that out, it's not. I'm not trying to say that this video is the best piece of criticism I've ever received, but I think generally speaking, my favorite kinds of criticism and the most important forms of criticism have come from conversations with people like Ryan that I've had at university. So it's, if anything, just a kind of glimpse into that kind of honest, open conversation, which I think his first video really exemplifies. So there is, of course, a link in the description if you want to go and watch that video, and do subscribe to his channel. As I say, it's brand new. And we disagree on a lot, but the disagreements that I've had with him have always been constructive. So I'm sure that the videos he's going to put out in the future, criticizing more ideas from different people, are going to be equally constructive too. Maxwell's silver hammer came down upon her head asks what are some of my favorite books, fiction and non-fiction. I actually made a video not long ago giving 50 book recommendations, which is quite a lot to be getting along with, I think, so I'll leave a link to that video in the description as well if anyone's interested. And speaking of Maxwell's silver hammer, I've been asked on Instagram what my favorite Beatles song is. I'm kind of going to cheat here, I think, because my favourite song that they ever released was actually a cover of a song called Till There Was You. It's on their second album. If you haven't listened to it, I'd recommend it. It's one of my favourite songs they ever put out. Question on YouTube: what would you say is your most controversial opinion? That's quite a tricky question. If you mean aside from the fact that the second Beatles album with the Beatles is probably my favourite album that they put out, which might just be the most controversial opinion that I hold, there are a few things that come to mind here. The first of which, quite boringly and predictably perhaps, is veganism. I mean, when I first went vegan, I really wasn't expecting the kind of reaction that I got online. I mean, I've discussed so many philosophical topics. You know, I discuss ethics, I've discussed politics and free speech, I've discussed religion. But when I started talking about animal rights, you know, and I don't know how many videos I've made, but it's not been many. It's probably just a handful of actual videos dedicated to animal rights on YouTube. All of a sudden, everybody's jumping on me for being pushy and preachy and talking about this too much and trying to shove my opinion down people's throats, even though nobody complained when I did exactly the same thing with atheism or with free speech or with ethics or whatever it may be. I never got any of that. And I just started doing exactly what I'd always done, right? Making response videos, making philosophical videos, just giving an overview of a general topic that I think is important or interesting, in this case, the ethics of animal exploitation. And suddenly everybody's opinion seemed to switch. Well, no, I mean, everybody is obviously an exaggeration, but there was far more of it than I would have expected, especially because it came from the same people who previously had applauded me for speaking up on issues that I considered important. You know, when I made a video, I don't know, about Sohail Arabi being imprisoned in Iran and how we shouldn't rest until this man is freed, or at least we've made as much noise about it as we possibly can, people agreed with me. They said, yeah, you're right. How can we just sit back and do nothing? This is really important. And I don't care if it makes people uncomfortable. I'm going to make sure that I'm banging on the door of the Iranian embassy until this man is freed. But when I do exactly the same thing, except now I'm talking about the exploitation of non-human animals, so I say, you know, I don't think that we have the right to put a pig in a gas chamber because we like the taste of its flesh. Now people want to say, hey, you know, don't show me that footage, it makes me uncomfortable, don't force your opinion down my throat, you know, you don't need to talk about it all the time, give it a rest, this kind of stuff. It's a real inconsistency in approach. And I don't mind people criticizing, don't get me wrong, I really don't mind people criticizing me, saying that my views about animal liberation are incorrect or wrong or philosophically misguided or something. But the criticism that I've received specifically about the approach just bemuses me, because my approach hasn't changed. It's always been the same to any ethical issue that I consider important, but that's what people are criticizing. People are quite rarely saying things like, I think you've got the ethics wrong. They say, look, implicitly they say, I think you might be right on the ethics, but you need to rethink the way you're going about it. I mean, if it worked for everything else I've ever done on this channel, then I think it will work for veganism too. Another potentially controversial opinion that I hold, although perhaps not as inflammatory as something like veganism, is the idea that death is not bad for the person who dies, and that it can't be bad for the person who dies. And this is actually exactly what this long video that I keep hinting at is going to be on. I'm making a really large, in-depth discussion about whether death is bad. It's a topic that I've wanted to talk about for a really long time, actually, but I had to put it on hold because when the coronavirus outbreak happened, I thought it might be a little bit insensitive, given how many people were dying, to make a video saying, you know, is death really that bad? But the video will hopefully show why it is that I conclude that death is not bad for the person who dies. And the reason this is controversial is because death is universally seen as a bad thing. And don't get me wrong, dying can be bad, the process of dying, and death is also extrinsically bad. It's bad for the people around you when you go and this kind of stuff. But I think kind of being dead, let's say, can't be bad for the person who's dead by definition, because it's not something you experience. It's a little more complicated than that, because there are all kinds of accounts that say that it can be bad, like a deprivation account that says it's not bad, positively speaking, it's not a positive feature of death that makes it bad, but the fact that you're restricted from living longer. You know, you're deprived of something rather than there being kind of an actively bad thing, and the deprivation of a good thing is what kind of makes it bad. There's a lot of stuff to discuss there, and the reason this is so controversial is because it seems to imply that there are situations in which, you know, if you kill a person instantly and painlessly, that it's not bad for that person. We have to be careful here, of course, because I wouldn't advocate that being a morally permissible thing to do for a whole variety of reasons. But I would still hold to the view that once that person is actually dead, it doesn't make any sense to talk about what's good or bad for them because they no longer exist. I've also previously caught a lot of flack, and it seems to be quite controversial when I've spoken about abortion. Quite recently, somebody tweeted that abortion is okay under any circumstance whatsoever, and I retweeted it saying, this is trivially untrue to me. I can at least think of some hypothetical situations in which it would be at least morally questionable to have an abortion. For instance, if we discovered a gay gene and you could see that the baby was going to be gay, would it be moral to abort a child on the basis that they were going to be gay, right? I think this is at least morally dicey territory, right? But the controversy comes in when people just assume it's a completely settled question that can't even be questioned, right? If I say something like, well, look, we need to at least consider that it might be wrong in this circumstance or that circumstance, or at least give the argument its due, people would get angry because of the political implications of that. It's like, well, you're giving in to right-wing arguments, you're giving them space to breathe and this kind of stuff. But unfortunately, when it comes to philosophy, if I want to hold an ethical position seriously, if I want to be pro-choice, or if you want to be pro-life for that matter, you have to make sure that you've considered it thoroughly and properly and given the argument its due. And if it's controversial, just to at least consider that abortion might be wrong in some circumstances, then I think perhaps the word controversy just loses any meaning in philosophy and ethics. Another question from YouTube. I'm a big meat eater, and I've been listening to a lot of your vegan commentary later. You've definitely convinced me that veganism is morally preferable. However, I can't really find motivation to become vegan. What might you say to someone like me who just likes meat a lot? Well, first, thanks, and I'm glad to hear it. But this is a really important question because there are kind of two parts of the puzzle here when it comes to going vegan. The first is being, say, morally or rationally convinced that it's wrong to exploit animals for food. But the second, as you say, is finding this actual personal motivation. And that tends to be more of a kind of emotional thing. And that's not something I really touch on because I'm interested in doing ethics. But you do generally need some kind of internal motivation to actually live in accordance with the ethics that you become familiar with and become convinced by. But there is one thing that perhaps I can say here. You say, what might you say to someone like me who just likes meat a lot? And implicit in that is kind of the idea that, most people or most vegans maybe don't like meat a lot. I mean, as far as I can tell, they do. I mean, I love the taste of meat. I love the taste of animal products. I could never deny that these products taste amazing, right? That's the reason people eat them so much, is because they just taste like nothing else, although we're getting pretty close. So I'm not sure, but maybe you'll find it reassuring to hear that I like the way that meat tastes as well. I think what we need to do is try not to deny or ignore or suppress the fact that we're tempted to eat these things because they taste so nice, but just get it into our heads that something like taste pleasure is just in a different moral universe to something like torture and exploitation and killing of animals, right? So you don't have to deny that these things taste nice. You don't have to even get rid of that. Like, you can't get rid of it, right? You can't choose what you find tasty. But the idea that something being tasty should even be a minute consideration when it comes to something as serious as torturing and abusing an animal is absurd to me. So I think the best thing to do is try as hard as you can to relink the product to its source, right? When we walk past KFC, when we see food on a plate, we don't think of an animal, right? We think of it as food, and partly that's because of the way that it's been processed and it's covered in breadcrumbs, and it's difficult to remember where it came from. But if you try hard enough each time you see these products to make an active effort to remember where they came from and think of the suffering that the animals went through in order to get that on your plate, once that link is made, sure, the temptation is there in the sense that you look at it and think, I bet that tastes nice. But you'll just be overwhelmed by the ethical considerations of the treatment of the animals that temptation will just disappear, or at least become minute by comparison. I've been struggling to find motivation and a reason to live in a world where free will doesn't exist. I'm sure when you discovered that free will is an illusion, you must have had a similar experience, so how do you deal with that? Well, this is quite a popular question, right? I get asked this quite a lot, and it's quite a serious one if it's really troubling you to the extent that you're struggling to find meaning in life. But this didn't happen to me, and I don't think it should happen, and I don't think it makes sense to say that because free will doesn't exist, therefore any meaning that once was in your life now has to disappear. One of the most interesting things about the psychology of free will to me is that it's impossible to not kind of live with that illusion that you do have free will. I mean, I can fully rationalize the idea that free will is ultimately an illusion, but it still feels like I have it. And I think that at least part of the reason for that is that although you don't exactly get to choose what you want, this is kind of the anti-free will argument, you do get to do what you want. Right? So the anti-free will argument is that, yeah, you can do whatever you want, but you don't get to control what you want. But you still get that feeling of agency, because although you don't control what you do want to do is what determines your action, right? So the thing that's determining your action is, at least in some sense, or at least in one level, interior to you. It's part of yourself. It's part of your desires. The very argument against free will is that you'll always do what you want, right? You're going to pursue pleasures, and you're going to avoid things that you think will bring you suffering and this kind of stuff. But interestingly, I think that if you ask someone who believes in free will, probably needs to be an atheist for this to be reliably the case, but if you ask them what they think brings them meaning in life, what is it that infuses their life with meaning, they'll probably say something like, well, I like pursuing pleasures. The pursuit of happiness is one of the things detailed in the Declaration of Independence for a reason, because it's seen as one of the most important ways in which a human being can find meaning and purpose in life. And the anti-free will argument doesn't remove that. It further entrenches it. It says that the very defining thing about your actions and who you are as a person is the pursuit of these pleasures and the avoidance of these sufferings. So if before you were convinced that free will doesn't exist, that's where you found meaning, where I think a lot of people do find it, then nothing's changed. It would only need to change if before you were convinced that free will didn't exist, you found your meaning through something to do with choice and being the author of your action. But I think it's vague and strange to say something like the meaning and purpose I have in life comes from the fact that absolutely nothing outside of myself is determining my action. I think like a sentence like that said in isolation or out of context would sound absolutely bizarre. Don't get me wrong, I understand the intuition that it's troubling and uncomfortable to be convinced that you're not ultimately in control of your actions, but the idea that it needs to remove meaning, that's only true, in my view, if you had previously a kind of weird definition of what meaning is. Every time that I've spoken to an atheist and asked them what brings them meaning and purpose, they've answered with things which are completely compatible, if not reinforced by an anti-free will philosophy. So hopefully thinking along those lines will help you to come to terms with finding meaning in a world without free will, but just recognize that you're perfectly capable of finding that meaning. And if you can't, I don't think it was a problem with free will. I think it's a problem with something else, right? I think, in other words, if you can't find meaning in pursuing pleasures and these kinds of things, then I think you'd have struggled to find meaning even if free will did exist. And quite a few people have asked me my opinion on pet ownership. Since I've been talking about animal rights, that is, people say, well, what do you think about having a dog or a cat or something like that? Well, I think that most people who have cats and dogs are good owners, quote unquote, but this is the problem. I think it's the way that we think about it. It's not necessarily how we're treating the animals that needs to be shifted, but just the way that we're thinking about ownership in general. I don't think it's right to think of owning an animal. If you look at like a really good, ideal dog owner, one of the things you'll probably find is that they see that dog as part of the family, right? They say, this isn't like a dog that we own. It's like it's man's best friend. It's a member of the family. I let it sleep on the bed and sit on the sofa. In other words, it's not being treated like property, right? And ownership implies property. And I think it's wrong to think of these animals as property of human beings. And the problem with the language and concept of ownership as applied to animals is outlined quite well by Gary Francione in Animal Rights, the Abolitionist Approach, I think it's what it's called. I'll leave a link in the description. But the problem is that ownership, as I say, implies property. And if something's your property, it means that its worth is determined by you. For something to be your property, it means it's yours to do with as you please and determine what it's worth, what you could sell it for, what you do with it, this kind of stuff. But I think rightfully so, we already have restrictions on the treatment of at least pets. Although I think, factory farm animals probably look with envy upon the animal rights laws and restrictions that we have on our pets that we love. But I would see it as analogous to a child or something like this, right? Like if you have a child, you determine when that child is awake and sleeping, you determine when the child eats, you determine what the child eats, you basically control the child's entire life, but you don't own the child. Right? It would be quite a despicable notion to think that you own another human being. It's one of these kind of ethical concepts which is almost universally condemned in the modern day, that ownership of human beings is a bad idea in principle. Right? Even if you treat them well, it's wrong to say that you own them, that they're your property. In the same way, I think it can be perfectly okay, and in fact admirable, if you have something like a rescue dog, like a stray dog that you've brought into your home and you're giving it a good life and you're treating it well. This is a really good, positive thing to do. But you don't own that dog. What's the best argument in favour of cancel culture? I've been asked this a few times. I actually recently did an interview with a student newspaper called the Oxford Blue, where we talked a little more in depth about cancel culture. I'll leave a link to that in the description as well. There's also a video version if you prefer to watch it. But I'll give you a few thoughts here as well. I think the best argument in favour of cancel culture is really the only argument in favour of cancel culture, which is that it holds people to account for, let's say, morally questionable things that they've done either recently or in the past. Right, sure, yeah, sounds like a good idea. If someone's done something wrong, we should hold them accountable for it. Sure. But the problem with cancel culture, and the reason that I'm against it, is not because I think that people shouldn't be held accountable for things, even that they've done a long time ago. I think it's worth kind of resurfacing them and saying, listen, have you changed your mind since then? Do you apologize? Have you changed the way that you're thinking about these issues? Fine. But the number one rule about punishment, and essentially cancel culture is a form of punishment, at least a social punishment. The number one rule, the golden rule with punishment, is that the punishment must fit the crime, right? This is universally acknowledged in our legal and moral philosophy, that if you're going to punish someone for something, it has to be proportionate. Now, don't get me wrong, some of the things that people say and do on social media are really bad, right? But consider the power of social media when it's weaponized. Never before in human history have we had the ability for a random person, and not even a public figure or an author or a monarch or something like that, but just anybody on planet Earth, to become the center of the entire world's attention. Right? Not just their village or their town, not just their country even, but the entire world, with all their eyes on them, judging them and wanting to punish them. The power of that is just unprecedented, and what we're essentially doing with cancel culture, when the entire world turns against a person in the most extreme cases for saying something morally questionable or morally wrong or even morally outrageous, what we're doing is the equivalent of taking a nuclear bomb and dropping it on a single individual. Another argument in favor of cancel culture is that it's effective. And yeah, sure as hell, it's effective. That's a bit of an understatement. If you turn the entire world against a single individual for saying something morally outrageous, yeah, they're not going to say that again, and you can bet they're probably going to apologize. But okay, let me give you another example of an effective punishment for your consideration. Let's say that we want people to stop cheating on their partners, right? It's not a nice thing for someone to abuse someone's trust and cheat on them in this manner. So let's say that we institute a rule where every time someone is caught cheating, we institute capital punishment. We kill them. We hang them publicly. That's going to be effective as hell. Believe me, rates of cheating are going to plummet, right? No one's going to be cheating on their partners if they know they're going to be hung for it. It's going to be an incredibly effective way to bring down the amount of people who are being cheated on. The problem is that the punishment is completely disproportionate. Now, I'm not saying that people don't deserve to be held accountable for cheating on their partners. They do. And that we need some kind of way of holding them accountable that's going to be effective. Of course we do. But to drop this level of punishment all at once from all around the world on a single individual is just too much. And another thing to consider is about the psychology of deterrence, because essentially what we're trying to do is deter people either from offending again or from seeing someone else who's committed a moral offense and committing it themselves. But there's something interesting to consider about the psychology of being deterred from doing something wrong or committing a crime. And that's this. It's not really severity of the punishment that's most effective in deterring people, but certainty of capture. And this is true in criminal law as well. What I mean by that is the thing that will deter somebody from doing something wrong or committing a crime or something like that is not a philosophy of, if we catch you, we're going to give you all we've got, which is essentially what cancel culture does. It says, if we catch you out on this, we're going to make sure that every single institution you're ever invited to speak at knows that you said it and uninvite you for having said it. We're going to make sure you're never employed again. We're going to make sure you never have friends again. We're going to ruin your social life. Basically, if you do get caught, you're going to see hell, right? That's one way of looking at the philosophy of deterrent. But the more important thing, I think, is not that severity, but the certainty that this kind of accountability will be applied. And the interesting thing to consider is that if you can ensure this kind of certainty of capture in criminal law, that is, certainty that the person will be caught by the authorities, but analogous to cancel culture would be like the certainty that people are going to be called out, is that the severity of punishment can be really, really lowered, right, and still be effective. Consider, for example, smoking weed. Right? In the United Kingdom, as far as I know, it's still illegal to smoke weed, but a lot of people do it. And I think the reason for that is that you're not going to get caught, right? If you have a blunt in your back garden, there's no way you're going to get caught for it. But let's consider two different approaches to try and stop people from smoking weed. Not that I would want to, but as I say, it's just an example. So one approach the authorities might take is an approach of severity, right? They might say something like, if we catch you smoking weed, we're going to give you 10, 15, 20 years in jail. It's going to be a really, really bad prison sentence if you're caught doing it. I don't think this is really going to deter anyone, right? Reason being, as I say, if you're just in your garden smoking some weed, it's like the likelihood that you're going to be captured is so small that you're not really going to be bothered by the severity of the punishment. But now consider another approach. Suppose that the police instead kept the punishment quite low. They said it's just going to be like a fine, like a £100 fine or something like that. But you were almost certainly going to be captured, right? If you smoke weed, it's like, yeah, you're going to be caught doing it. this would be more likely to deter people from smoking weed, right? Because even though the punishment is way, way less than 15, 20 years in jail or something like that, it's just a £100 fine. If you're quite confident that you're going to be caught and you're going to have to pay that fine, that's what's going to deter you. Even though the punishment is much less, the certainty and reliability with which it's going to be put upon you is going to be what deters you. And the reason that I'm talking about this in terms of cancel culture is that we need to change our approach. Because as I say, I agree with the proponents of cancel culture in the two main points, which is that accountability is important and that effectiveness is important. But what I would recommend is a change in approach from severity to certainty. Let's stop when we find someone who made a racially insensitive joke on Twitter or something. Let's stop dropping the nuclear bomb on them. Let's give them a more proportionate punishment, but make sure that we're more comprehensive in calling people out for doing these kinds of things, for saying things which we consider to be immoral or acting in immoral ways. If we see it happen, we need to be more comprehensive and confident in calling it out. But don't be so severe and don't try to ruin their lives. Say, listen, I think you should apologize for this. I think you should be held accountable, but I'm not going to get you fired, and I'm not going to make sure that you'll never be employed again. I'm not going to make sure that I'm going to ruin your social life as well. But make sure that when that punishment is lowered and when we kind of realize that we really don't need to be giving people hell for the things that they do which are wrong, that we need to be more comprehensive. The certainty of capture needs to be there in order to keep the deterrent. So if we want something that's going to hold people accountable and do it effectively, the answer doesn't lie in the severity of the punishment, which is what cancel culture promotes. It lies in the certainty of capture and the lowering of the amount of punishment that we're inflicting upon people, which means, no, it's not a good idea to turn the entire world against a single individual because they made a bad Snapchat story or something. Of course, there are things that people are cancelled for which are far, far worse than something like a bad joke, right? Although we do see this happening all the time, people being cancelled for something like a joke. Of course, there are examples of much, much worse behaviour that really does deserve a kind of life-altering kind of punishment. But these are the kind of things which are illegal, right? Like if a police officer murders somebody, commits police brutality and murders somebody unjustifiably, sure, we might think we want to cancel them, but like what we really want is for them to be arrested, right? It no longer becomes a matter of cancel culture, it becomes a matter of criminal law. I think that's when cancel culture needs to kind of move away. We effectively cancel them by putting them in jail, right? The thing that kind of remains in our power, just as an average citizens, people who just use social media, the only thing that we're going to have meaningful power on is on these kind of lower tier immoralities, so to speak, when people say things that are questionable or do things that are questionable and we have an opportunity to hold them accountable for it. Yeah, let's go ahead. But as I say, the severity of the punishment needs to fit the severity of the crime. And if the crime is bad enough, then this is where something like criminal law comes in. But if the severity is kind of on the lower scale, then turning the entire world against a person or even a company, really, I don't think could be morally justified. But nice. Okay, we'll end it there. Thank you for watching. Thanks for sticking with me. I was thinking about this. If you like Q&As, because I really don't know, I don't do enough Q&As to really get a lot of feedback on them, but if you like this style of video where I just kind of answer smaller questions more quickly, then let me know, because I could happily do more of these. They're quite easy to make. I could do them every month or every 2 months or something like that. If it's something that you enjoy, then let me know and I can certainly make more of them. But so thank you for 350,000 subscribers, or whatever the number is by the time that you're actually watching this. And as always, a special thanks to my supporters on Patreon, especially my top tier patrons. Everything I do is supported by you on Patreon, so if you like what I'm doing, then please do consider becoming a supporter at patreon.com/Cosmic Skeptic, or by clicking the link in the description. And keep your eyes peeled for this video about death and whether death is bad. So if you're not already subscribed, make sure that you hit that button, smash that like button, etc., etc. I think around 50% of the people who generally watch my videos aren't subscribed, so do consider just pressing that button. It only takes a second. And if you are subscribed, there's the notification bell as well, because I know YouTube keep changing the way that they're recommending videos and the subscription feed and things like that. So if you want to make sure that you know when new videos are coming out, especially this video about death that I'm planning, then hit the notification bell. But with that said, I'm going to get back to work on planning said video and have it out to you as soon as possible. But thank you for watching in the meantime. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.